Right now, I'm in a very iconic area of SoHo. And you guys probably recognize this area for the hype that it had back in 2014 to 2019, I want to say. This is where all the up-and-coming clothing brands would have their drops. Like, it almost felt like every other month or every single month, almost, it felt like there was like a new hype brand of clothing that you had to go to around this area, and people would just line up. And now it's like fairly empty. You know, there's not really much going on around here. People are more. You'll probably more likely find people literally like 2 blocks down in Little Italy, where you know, it's a little more exciting around here. But you know, back in the day, this used to be the area that was popping. And you know, back in the day when I was like a kid in high school, it felt like that hype would last forever. But the fact is, it didn't. You know, and there's probably a few brands that, you know, are pretty well off as a result of the hype that was happening back in the day. But the fact is, it's not like that in this area anymore. And I think a big part of that hype was, thankfully, to Virgil Abloh. Rest in peace to him. He passed away. But, you know, thanks to him and Off-White, like, you know, this used to be a really, really exciting area. But the hype didn't last. I wanted to make this video just to show you guys, or tell you guys, that the hype that you have today is most likely going to be fleeting by tomorrow, you know, or in a few months, by next year. You know, it's going to fade eventually. And I think, you know, it's important for us to be sentimental about the memories that we have growing up as a child, but it's important to know that the past is the past and the present is what you make of it today. You know, you can't really change anything that's happening in the past. You know, a lot of people are still in pandemic head mode, in that headspace of the pandemic where they feel helpless and they can't really do much. And I'm just saying all that just to say this, you know, 2020 was half a decade ago. Half a decade. And in another half a decade, it's going to be 2030. You know, that's the year that they're saying, you know, AI is going to be taking most of our jobs. You know, I see it on the news every day. AI is about to take our jobs. You know, I see it on social media. You know, I see anchormen, you know, crying on TV. They're like, oh man, wondering about what's happening to our jobs. You know, even our mainstream media is trying to fearmonger us into thinking, you know, we're kind of cooked when AI is here. I know it's easy to complain about, you know, the government that's in charge of us. You know, we've been complaining about our president for the last 4 years, and now I see people complaining again. Are we going to complain again for another 4 years? You know, by then it's definitely going to be 2030. By the time we get our next president, it's going to be 2028. You know, where are you going to be when 2028 comes, after you're done complaining about what's happening to your life? We're at the halfway mark. Halfway through 2025. What have you done so far in 2025? Let me know in the comments. You know, where did you put yourself in the position that you are today from the beginning of the year? You know, but I just wanted you to think about that for a little. You know, what have you done? What moves have you made so far? You know, it's halfway through 2025 and playtime is over. You know, I'll say you guys right here. Playtime is over. You know, think about what you've done. I want to etch this into your mind. Think about what you've done. You know, it's not a game anymore. You know, I like to think about the times I was in high school, 2020, 2016. I was in college back then. That's how far back high school was, and I still think about those days, but I can't think about those days all the time. You know, I really want you guys to think about, you know, what moves have you made, and right now I was just thinking about what I've done. You know, I've been posting on this YouTube channel consistently. You know, I may have missed like a week or two, but I still got on that bicycle after I fell off. And I want to think about things that you've done, even if they were mistakes, even if they were the wrong moves. You know, you don't fall in the same direction twice. That's what my ballet dance teacher said. When we were in a balance, when we were standing on one leg, if you fall to the left, don't fall to the left again. Fall to the right the next time you fall. At least you know you overcorrected for your mistakes. I want to know, what moves have you made? You know, are you really trying to get to where you want to be? Are you really trying to get to the place that you say you want to be? You know, last year, I wasn't sitting in a call every week with millionaires. Now, you know, things might be a little different for your boy. You become, what's that saying? If you hang around 5 millionaires, you become the 6th one. I don't know how accurate that is. I've heard other sayings, you know, you're more like to be the sum of the people that you compare yourself to. So either way, I'm comparing myself to the same people that I'm sitting around. What are you guys doing? We're 6 months into this year, you know. We're not exactly at the halfway point, but we're basically there, you know. You know, most of December you're celebrating the holidays with your family, so I think these are the conversations that we gotta start having with ourselves. These are the ones that you really need to, you know, hone in on yourself, you know. You don't have time to be sad. You don't have time to be depressed. You know, you gotta realize where you are, what situation are you in, and when you're working and you're achieving the goals, that depression starts to go away. I got 3 tasks done today, both business oriented and just, you know, personal tasks. And just doing those alone made me felt good. I was able to achieve all those in one day. Maybe tomorrow I'm only gonna get 1 task done. You know, maybe I won't get any task done, and maybe the day after that I'll get a task done. It doesn't matter. At least those are the moves that I'm making to make progress in my life. I just I was in Little Italy earlier doing some product shots for this brand. I'm not showing you the actual front of the label because I'm not trying to show you guys yet. But, you know, these are the types of tasks that I'm doing, you know. And I'm getting a really good, you know, benefit from the tasks that I'm doing. You know, it's not just about doing tasks, it's about doing the right tasks. Because I'm trying to make the right moves to get to the position that I am. Think about when you're playing a game of chess, you know, if you're trying to get your pawn to one end of the chessboard to the other, you're not going to be straightforward with your pawn. You're going to move your rook. You're going to move your, you know, your knight. You know, you can't let your opponents know your next move because they're going to clearly see you're trying to make one of your pawns a queen. But your opponent does know that's a very viable strategy. You know, that's a very smart move to make in chess. And I want you guys to know what your end goal's in. I'm trying to get into one of those buildings over there. I'm trying to get to the top of one of those penthouses right there. I'm trying to be chilling with the sun on the roof of one of these buildings. You know, that's the clear move equivalent to, you know, in chess, trying to get your pawn to be a queen. That's my pawn to queen. But you're not gonna get there just by moving your pawn forward. You gotta move your rook. You gotta move your priest thing. I forget what all the pieces are called. But you guys get the point. The moves that you were making in 2020, forget about those moves. If they were mostly mistakes, forget about the mistakes for now. You know, if anything, learn from your mistakes. Don't do the mistakes again. And think about what your next move is gonna be. You know, what are your next 2 moves gonna be? What are your next 5 moves gonna be? How can you position yourself to be in a way that you're going to achieve the ultimate happiness for you?
So then she emails me.
And if you guys want to let everyone else know in the comments, you know, put a comment. What moves have you made in 2025 so far? What have you done for yourself? What have you done to position yourself? to be where you want to be ultimately in your life. You know, I don't like seeing videos where there's people complaining all the time. You know, it just, when I see the improvement YouTubers, you know, they start complaining about, you know, who's in charge, and I'm over those types of content now. You know, I'm done with it. Those clearly don't help. You know, fear mongering doesn't help. You know, improvement does. What moves are you gonna make? What you know, I get the messaging. You know, I get why they want to put like a battery in your back, but people get stuck in that mode. You know, I hate it when people get stuck in modes. You know, you gotta switch from mode to mode sometimes. When you're driving, you're not always going to be in accelerate. Sometimes you're going to be in reverse. Sometimes you're going to be in park. You know, you're not always going to be in acceleration mode. You know, you don't have to be stuck in one mode. You know, there's different modes you can be in. And, you know, successful people understand that. You know, success, there's like a bird behind me. I don't know if you guys, they're like rustling behind me. But you know, when people see you trying, they want you to succeed, especially when it's, you know, you scratch my back, I scratch your back type of situation. You know, providing that value to people who are able to provide value to you, that's the best way to succeed in life. That's ultimately what you're going to do or going to need to do to achieve in this life. And successful people understand that type of thing. You know, it's how they've become successful. And I think they're more likely to want to do that with people than an AI. I'm going to be honest, you know, there's like AIs nowadays, you know, in the early stages, it's hard to know if you could actually trust an AI, but people who you build connections with, who you understand the history of, you understand their backstory, and you're able to connect from person to person, those are the people that you want to be around to succeed in life. You know, be around people that you want to be like. You know, AI is gonna, you know, clearly, obviously, AI has an advantage, a human advantage over, you know, how speedy and quick it can do work faster than a human. But you got to think about the elements that make you better than a robot. And I always think about, you know, there's an episode of Teen Titans where, I don't know if you guys know the show Teen Titans. Like, I feel like it's pretty well known, but back in the day, that show used to be hype. But there's like a character named Cyborg who's half robot, half human, and he had to look into his human factors to overcome the obstacles that he had to go over. You know, when he was thinking he was half robot, he was thinking he was just robot, and robots have limits, but humans can go beyond limits. And that's ultimately what you're gonna need to do to make it to the end of this life. Your adaptations, you know, your ability to adapt can surpass a robot, you know. And thinking about AI is scary. That's why I want that to get into your heads that AI is coming. You know, they're already trying to project that into our minds already. So usually when they're trying to project something, you know, it's sort of inevitably going to happen. And to sort of like hammer in this idea of overcoming limits with your own physicality, I saw an experiment that they did with mice, or I heard about this experiment where they had two mice. The first one, they put it in for like a certain amount of time. I don't know if this number is accurate, but just use this for an example. They left this mouse in this cup of water to drown. He was like swimming, and they were gonna leave him in for only 30 minutes. And after about, 25 minutes, he fell into the bottom of the water and drowned. The second one that they put into the cup of water, they left him in the cup of water for about like 5 minutes. And then after that 5 minutes, they pulled him out the water. And then they let the mouse calm down for a little bit, and then they put him back in the water. And then he started swimming again to make sure he didn't drown. And that mouse was able to survive in that water for an hour. Now, if you didn't get the idea of that experiment, it basically, the second mouse that didn't drown, even though he was left in the water longer, at least that mouse had this idea of he was able to be saved by the people doing the experiment, you know. It had that hope that if it survived long enough, it wasn't going to drown. You know, eventually someone was going to be out there to save it. And I think that experiment is very important, you know. You're much more capable than what you probably initially believe. If you have this idea that, you know, you're going to develop enough skills eventually to get yourself out of whatever deplorable situation that you're probably in, you're probably going to get yourself out of that. If you believe enough and you know that you're capable of doing it, eventually it's going to happen. And personally, I'm a guy that usually would pride myself on tradition, you know. Growing up, I feel like we all at one point wanted a traditional life, you know. Wanted to do the things that our parents did while we were growing up. And I think today, as we grow older and advance more in technology, you know, the things that usually worked in the past probably are not going to work nowadays. Or if they do, it's very rarely. And there's other ways you can get closer to success nowadays, you know. That's why there's so many experiments, and they're blasting music over here. Let me see if I can get away from this. That's why it's very powerful to put yourself in positions where you can experiment more. You know, it's not always going to work, but, you know, at least you're trying something new, and whatever you discover at the end, whether it works or it doesn't, you know, if it doesn't, you know not to do it again. Or if you try it again, you know what strategies you can use. You know, we're in a new age, and I know it's scary sometimes, but you gotta be more comfortable in working your way through things like that. Where I'm walking to, it's pretty scenic around here. Love the views around here. But I want you guys to really look at your life and really look at the things that you've done so far in this year alone. You know, forget all the other years. What did you do this year? You know, can you say that you're proud of what you've accomplished this year? Can you say that you really did everything that you could to get to where you want to be in life? Can you really say that? Again, halfway mark. This is halftime. No more games. If you said you were going to accomplish what you wanted to at the beginning of this year, did you stick to it? Did you at least try to stick to it? Did you quit, you know, 2 months in? You know, I know it could be difficult sometimes, but, you know, did you find yourself quitting? Did you find yourself getting back on that horse? I know it's difficult. I know life isn't always going to go exactly as you predicted. But are you at least trying? Are you trying to get into one of these buildings over here? You know, are you trying? Or did you just give up? Are you just watching this video in your room? You're just laying in bed. Have you been bed rotting all day, all week? You're just binge watching YouTube videos and you just stumbled across me. You know, if that's your position, then, you know, feel free to watch more of my videos. I'm still going to be trying to strive and get ahead. I'm just gonna walk around this view real quick just to see what I want to accomplish in life. wish I had the ability to feel like I had the time to just relax and sit and enjoy that view. You know, I want to be able to be proud of myself and my accomplishments when I actually achieve what I want to achieve, so I can be sitting just like those people, just lazing over there. Maybe they, you know, earned that ability to do so. I don't feel like I've earned that ability yet. You know, I'm not trying to be too harsh on you guys today, but I do want to put that battery in your back. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed what you heard in this video, if you guys resonated with anything that you've heard so far, let me know. You got a long life. You know, I don't want you guys to just put it to waste. You know, you can just as easily achieve this dream of success just as anyone else has. You know, we might not have the same tools as they did. You know, we might have more, we might have less. Maybe we just have different tools nowadays. And we just gotta figure those tools out. If you guys enjoyed what you heard in this video, if you guys felt something with anything that I said in this video, please let me know in the comments. And please let the other people know in the comments. Maybe they need some sort of spark, some sort of motivation in their life. And, you know, maybe you could get a response that will motivate you. You know, we're halfway through 2025, and, you know, we're still in go time. We're still in push for success mode. You know, we're still all trying to make it to that goal that we started at the beginning of the year. Yeah.